Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. at the conclusion of a great panel discussion on U.S. strategy in the Arctic. And we have with us somebody who has a little bit more free time on his hands than he did last week, Jim Townsend, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Obviously, there was talk, Senator Sullivan was, introduced the panel discussion, the Republican from Alaska, talked about, this was supposed to be the unveiling of the Arctic defense strategy that the Obama administration worked on. Obviously, Congress called for that, and it was one of the things that was a priority for Secretary Carter. Tell us a little bit about what the most salient features of this new strategy is going to be that we're going to see hopefully released here in the next couple of days.
Well, to me, actually, it's not necessarily what's in the strategy as much as it is that we have now gone through a couple of evolutions within the department to think about the Arctic and what we need to be doing there in terms of what are the problems there, what are the challenges, what are the risks, and what do we need to be doing to meet those risks, those challenges concerning defense. And this has not always been the case. The Arctic has been a bit of an orphan when it comes to an issue, when it comes to a regional set of problems. Now, however, I think we are beginning to get traction, and the Congress has been helpful here. They've been demanding this, including Senator Sullivan, and I think we have now gotten to a point where what you will see when it's released is better than its predecessor and something we can build on, because I don't think we are finished yet thinking through the Arctic. We're not finished yet dealing with how do we deal with those challenges, where do the resources come from, what do we need to do, and what's the priority there. So I think the important point is the study itself.
What do you think the new administration should do? Knowing what the new thing is going to say, what are some of the things that, where does the new administration need to build on this foundation?
Well, for me, having done Europe and NATO, I'm concerned about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, that part of the North Atlantic where Russian submarines and surface ships and their aviation comes down and into the Atlantic. The reason that's become a problem and a challenge for us is over the past few years, we've seen a great increase in the number of aircraft and the number of submarines coming down. The aircraft have sometimes gotten close into the airspace of a lot of NATO allies. We've had to send up jets to wave them off, to identify them, and we're finding that we've got a operational tempo there similar to what we saw in some of the Cold War. So this is something that as an alliance we have to pay attention to. The United States needs to. We have not operated up in the Arctic and in the North Atlantic to the degree that we used to. We're having to get back to doing some of that kind of operational work up there with P-8s and working with Norway, working with the UK, working with Iceland. So for me, and what I've had to work on, it's really that part of the theater of operations in Europe, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the Nordic, Baltic nations, that we've got to do a lot of work on. And the new administration, as I talk to my successor and we talk about the challenges, that'll be a big focus for me.
Talk to us a little bit about, you said you had the NATO portfolio. Obviously, you worked that hard. You were one of the people who was woken up in the middle of the night when Russia went into Crimea and did the invasion. Obviously, the United States, faced a lot of pressure. There were those who didn't want a response, some business interests in the United States and in Europe. But the United States and Britain worked together to push through sanctions, joined by other countries, obviously, to punish Russia for its invasion of a sovereign country on its border. What are the implications of some of the statements from, during when Donald Trump was president-elect, was a candidate and then president-elect, but also now that he's president? I want to get your views specifically on the notion that NATO is an obsolete alliance. How do you respond to that?
Well, NATO, the obsolescence of NATO or NATO adaptation to new crises, new challenges, has always been an issue for NATO since the very beginning. How do you keep this alliance relevant? How do you keep it in a place where it can change to meet new crises? And I think the president, when he gets to know NATO as an institution, as people, as a NATO Secretary General, when he goes to the summit that they'll have, I hope he begins to see NATO as an institution that adapts and has adapted. It's an institution that adapts to the degree the allies want it to adapt. So I think as the president understands that NATO has been successful in changing from the Cold War days to what it is today, and will continue to change and adapt, he'll understand that it's not obsolete. It would be obsolete if we had the same command structure and the same strategy that we had in 1990 or 1989. NATO's gone through 2 or 3 major changes to incorporate structurally and as well as in terms of plans to incorporate the new challenges, including counterterrorism. I think the president was talking off the top of his head about a NATO that, that might be the conventional wisdom in the business community, but I can tell you that is not the fact, and I think what he'll see as he gets to know NATO is NATO's not obsolete, NATO can adapt, NATO's doing a lot of things, but NATO is governed by the allies, and the United States leads those allies. So if there's more adaptation or change that NATO needs to do, the U.S. needs to lead that.
What are the potential implications? I mean, NATO has adapted, as you were saying, obviously went to more of a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency focus in Iraq, in Afghanistan where it was a formal mission, although a lot of the NATO members also participated in Iraq. And after the Crimea invasion, it was more of a focus on that strategic deterrent mission that sort of came back, given so many nations had invested so much in Afghanistan as a mission. Would it be, and obviously the president is now talking about, would like to have more of a counterterrorism focus on NATO. How much is NATO doing on the counterterrorism front? And would it be a strategic mistake to refocus the alliance only on counterterrorism at the expense of strategic deterrence?
That's absolutely right. We cannot allow ourselves to be focused only on one mission within the alliance. And I think that's part of the problem during the post-9/11 days. As the alliance got increasingly engaged in Afghanistan, I think allies themselves, as well as NATO as an institution, probably shaped themselves a little bit too much to handle an expeditionary, coin-oriented strategy and mission. And so a lot of the other capabilities that you would need for other types of warfare, that atrophied. When the Russians went into Crimea and then into eastern Ukraine, I think that was a wake-up call that we had neglected a bit our own backyard. And other allies had told us that. And I think we were so busy doing other things that we didn't see the threat the way they did. And when the Russians came in, we had to play catch up, and we're still doing that. And so the counterterrorism mission is an interesting one. Counterterrorism, is in the first and foremost isn't a domestic law enforcement and intelligence responsibility, and a lot of allies, and probably the United States, don't want necessarily NATO to play that leading role. These are things, this kind of counterterrorism role is something that the nations themselves must do themselves. Not that they're not aided by the European Union in some ways or NATO in some ways in terms of maybe intelligence sharing or dealing with ISIL. I mean, a lot of the terrorism, of course, is ISIL-driven. And as the alliance works with the counter-ISIL coalition to defeat ISIL on the battlefield, that gets at counterterrorism at the source. So I think really, again, I think the president has to take a look at what he understands counterterrorism to be and what a NATO mission should be there. I don't think the allies and NATO shun a counterterrorism mission, but it's got to be the right one, and it's got to be in a priority that makes sense too. So I think a lot of the next year or two is going to be the president understanding NATO better, and then maybe we might have a different perspective coming from him in a year or two.
What are the potential implications, though? Because the Trump team has suggested that the easing of sanctions would be a priority. Let's do this as a goodwill gesture towards the Russians. We need their cooperation on ISIS. Obviously, for the first time, there was a coordinated airstrike between the U.S. and Russia in Syria just I think the day after the inauguration. What are the implications for lifting sanctions on Ukraine? Is that something that could potentially backfire, and if so, how?
Well, I think, and certainly the president, who is known for his art of the deal, understands that you can't really do something as major as lifting sanctions without there being a quid pro quo of some type. There's got to be action on the other side. So before I think we can sit down and talk about lifting sanctions, we've got to hear from the Russians what they're going to do in return. And what the West has said is that you've got to make progress on the accords that we're trying to work out to deal with eastern Ukraine. There's got to be a disengagement of Russian forces, either covert or overt, that are in Ukraine. There's a lot of things that we need to see from Russia. So before we can sit down and do something unilaterally, in this case, it'd be the U.S. lifting U.S. sanctions. We got to get something for it, but the EU, of course, puts on a lot of sanctions as well, and the allies are going to be, and the EU members are going to be looking very carefully what the U.S. does. What might we do unilaterally? What might we do together? Which is how we have been working on the sanctions. This is something that the U.S. and the EU have done in coordination. So I think sitting down and doing something unilaterally as a goodwill gesture, I hope that's not on the table, and I don't think it is. I think, again, the president being famous for his deal making, he understands he's got to get something for what he puts on the table, and we'll see what he has in mind.
And the original sense was ease those sanctions, potentially make some other concessions in order to get Russia's cooperation in the fight against ISIS, but also to restrict arms flow going to Iran, for example, given that Iran is seen also as sort of a key strategic challenge. But would the dropping of sanctions, let me take you to this. There is concern among some countries that the United States, given Russia's request for more, quote, strategic breathing room on its borders, could lead to the withdrawal of NATO forces from the Baltics and Poland, something that Russia has been very passionate about, getting those forces out of there. What are the potential implications, whether the United States or any NATO ally moves to move their forces out from these critical reassurance missions?
Well, I think that's probably going through the minds of a lot of allies who are wondering just what is it that the U.S. May or may not do in the coming months in terms of our forces, whether it's in Poland, the Armored Brigade Combat Team that on a bilateral basis we've begun to rotate into Poland, or whether it's the U.S. battalion that we've put into Poland with a NATO hat. What is the U.S. thinking about that? Or how susceptible are we to the Russians coming to us and saying, look, let's start a new relationship. You pull your forces back, and in return, we'll do something in Syria or in Iran or whatever it might be. I think there's some nervousness about that kind of deal being cut, some grand bargain that involves those chips. That also belong to NATO and to the nations like the UK. They've got forces that are going to Estonia. So I'm sure when the Prime Minister comes to talk to the President, she's going to say, so are you going to cut and run here? Are you going to make a separate deal? Or should we put money into moving forces into Estonia if you're going to be pulling out? What's going on? So I think that question is on the minds of everyone, and that's something that the new administration is going to have to address pretty quickly, because we've got a NATO ministerial just around the corner. There's the Munich Security Conference where everyone is going to be wondering, so will U.S. deployments to Europe be shaped by a new relationship with Russia?
You've heard, obviously, from a lot of our allies. You talked to a lot of them in terms of expressing concern. I was in the Pentagon last week, and I've talked to my friends overseas who've been expressing concerns. What's the message you think that this administration needs to deliver loudly and clearly coming from the president in order to reassure its allies in Europe?
That we're not going to surprise them with some major move coming out of the White House. In other words, when we talk about U.S. force deployments to Europe, when we talk about other aspects of alliance business, we're not going to do this in isolation and announce something from the White House and surprise everyone that we're going to be working this together, that we will make sure allies know if we're going to make changes one way or another. We're going a lot on rhetoric that we've heard the president make during the campaign, during the transition. That makes it sound like he's going to come in and really make some major changes. I haven't seen that yet, that in fact that's going to be the case. So I think there's a lot of anxiety that might not be necessarily justified. But we'll have to see, and it's up to the administration to make sure allies feel that we're not irrational, that allies understand that we are predictable, that we're going to be working with them. We're not going to surprise them. We're not going to leave them in the lurch. That we are going to be the good ally that they've come to depend on since 1949.
And one last question on the European Union. In his interview with Bild and with the Times, at the time he was president-elect, days before becoming president, Mr. Trump said that it didn't really. He didn't really think a lot about whether or not the EU dissolves or not, that it wasn't significant for him. Why is the EU, from your standpoint, something that is strategically important for the United States?
Well, we need a strong Europe. We need a strong Europe economically. We need a strong Europe militarily. We need a strong Europe when it comes to being an ally and partner with the United States based on shared values. If we don't have that, if we have a Europe that is once again like in the 1930s, balkanized, if you will, nations going off and depending only on their own to ensure their own defense. You have a renationalization, if you will, of defense budgets. You're going to end up with a fractured Europe that is not as strong as it would be if it was together. NATO and the EU as institutions have brought these smaller nations together and given strength to that continent. If that begins to wither and go away, the institutions can stay there. But if they are not effective, like the League of Nations, if they're not effective in making strength out of disparate nations, then the U.S. is going to be left holding the bag. We need a partner to handle global issues. We need a partner, not just trade, but in terms of defense, that can help us deal with problems in the world, and also that brings strength to the United States in terms of trade. If the EU goes away or becomes weak, or nations leave it and you've got a continent that's kind of split, you're going to have a weakened EU, you're going to have a weakened Europe, and we will pay the price. A very good example is the coalition against ISIL. A lot of the airstrikes are being run by European allies and partners. They're dropping the bombs. We don't have to. They're doing it. French, UK Special Operations Forces work closely with us in hotspots. There's a lot of participation by allies that allow us to scale back the numbers that we participate in. If in fact, economically, Europe suffers, and so their defense spending drops, and their political willingness to get involved in the coalition, as that begins to get weak, we are left holding the bag. And that's what we always have to remember.
The president, though, made very clear in his inaugural address that it will be America first in everything, build and buy American and build American. Obviously, the United States for decades has worked to have a much more cooperative relationship on armaments, in particular European allies, stepped up. American soldiers were protected by Israeli armor, British electronics and jamming equipment, and French gear. What are the potential negative implications from a security perspective of having an American-first strategy at this point when you have so many right-wing movements that are growing up in Europe as well?
Well, it's always been America first. I mean, what's interesting to me is Trump has given voice and a slogan that, of course, we knew from the 1930s, the America Firsters back then, which was not a very good turn of events back in those days. But it has always been, as we have made policy in the government, every day when I would sit down and I would be confronted with a problem, it was always shaped by, well, what's important for U.S. national security, i.e., what's good for America, what's so good for America first here. We don't say what's good, Europe first or Asia first or what's good for Europe here. We say what's good for America. And what's good for America is a strong NATO and a strong Europe. So this idea of America first, always America first, that's mom and apple pie, of course. But how that's implemented is what is good for America. It involves good trading relationships. It involves defense cooperation between American defense companies and European defense companies. And as always, the business community is out ahead anyway. It's not, you don't really find American companies and European companies. They're blended in a lot of ways. But this idea that America first means only buying American, and which we've have had a law for years to do that, by the way. But this idea that America first means it's zero sum. It's us at the expense of everybody else. No, you can have America first based on cooperation that is good for the United States. If we cooperate within NATO and we have a stronger transatlantic defense partnership and alliance, That's good for America. That is America first, because a strong NATO means America first because it gives us strength, first and foremost. It gives us allies, so less American troops are deployed and killed. We share that burden with our allies. So that is America first. So it's really one's perspective, and we'll have to see for the president what he means by America first. And I'm hoping what he means is what all of us have used as our North Star, and that is what's good for U.S. national security. And what's good for U.S. national security is America first. And in my world, strong Europe, strong EU, strong NATO, that's America first.
And Jim, one last question. What are you going to be doing next? Do you know?
Oh, probably having lunch, and that's all I know.
Fantastic, Jim. Thanks very, very much, and all the best.
Thank you so much, and it's great to see you.